The Age of Industrialization. This lesson is about the big changes in industries during the 18th and 19th centuries. It explains how work moved from being done by hand to using machines in factories, how it changed the economies and societies everywhere. The lesson also shows how industrialization affected different people like workers, traders, and craftsmen. It also discusses how colonialism influenced the growth of industries in countries like India. Before the Industrial Revolution, industrialization is generally linked to factory production and factory workers, but it began even before factories were built. Before factories appeared in England and Europe, large-scale production for international markets was already happening, and this period was called proto-industrialization. In the 17th and 18th centuries, merchants from towns moved to the countryside to get peasants and artisans to produce goods for them. These merchants supplied money and materials to rural workers who produced goods like cloth within their homes or farms, not in factories. Urban trade guilds means associations controlled production in towns, so merchants could not expand easily in cities. They went to the countryside where they could hire peasants and artisans. Poor peasants welcomed the chance to work for merchants because they needed extra income as their small farms could not support their families. That means the income that comes from their farming is not sufficient to run their families. Merchants coordinated the production process where peasants spun wool, weaved it, and sent it for finishing in places like London before it was sold internationally. This system connected the town and countryside, creating a commercial network without factories, with each merchant employing around 20 to 25 workers controlling hundreds of producers overall. The coming up of the factory. The first factories in England appeared in the 1730s, but their numbers grew rapidly only in the late 18th century. Cotton was the first major product of the new industrial era, with its production booming by the late 19th century. In 1760, Britain imported 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton, which increased to 22 million pounds by 1787 to meet the demands of its cotton industry. This increase was due to new inventions in the 18th century that made each step of cotton production, like carding, spinning, and rolling, more efficient, allowing workers to produce more and stronger yarn. Richard Arkwright invented the cotton mill, where all production processes were brought together under one roof, unlike earlier when cloth was made in village homes. The cotton mill allowed better control over production, quality, and labor, which was harder when work was done in the countryside. By the early 19th century, factories and mills became a common sight in England, and people were amazed by the new technology, focusing mainly on the large mills and forgetting about the small workshops where work still continued. The pace of industrial change. The process of industrialization was gradual and did not solely focus on factories. While factories grew, many industries still relied on traditional methods. Initially, the fastest growing industries in Britain were cotton and metals. Cotton led the industrial boom until 1840s, after which iron and steel became the dominant sectors, especially with the rise of railways. The expansion of railways both in England in the 1840s and in its colonies in the 1860s, it created a significant demand for iron and steel. By 1873, Britain was exporting more iron and steel than cotton, showing the shift in industrial focus. Despite the rise of modern industries, traditional industries like food processing, pottery, and furniture making continued to be significant. By the late 19th century, less than 20% of the workforce was employed in advanced industries. Textile production, in particular, still heavily relied on home-based workers rather than factory production, highlighting the continued importance of small-scale production. Traditional industries did not use steam engines, but managed to grow through small innovations, allowing them to survive alongside the newer industries. The adoption of new technology was slow due to the high cost and frequent breakdowns of machines, making merchants cautious about using them. A key example in James Watt's improved steam engine, patented in 1781, which took many years to be widely adopted due to its high cost and reliability issues. By the early 19th century, only 321 steam engines were in use across England, mostly in cotton, wool, mining, and iron industries. Many other sectors adopted the steam engine much later. Even as industrialization progressed, the majority of workers in the mid-19th century were still traditional craftsmen and laborers rather than machine operators, reflecting the slow and uneven pace of industrial change. Hand labor and steam power. In Victorian Britain, there was plenty of human labor because poor peasants and homeless persons moved to cities looking for work. Since there were so many workers, wages were low. So, industrialists didn't face labor shortages or high wage costs. Industrialists did not want to use machines that would replace workers and require large investments. Some industries needed workers only during certain seasons, like gasworks and breweries, which were busy during the cold months, and bookbinders and printers who needed extra workers before Christmas. In industries where production changed with the seasons, industrialists preferred to hire workers for the season instead of using machines. Certain products, especially those with intricate designs and specific shapes, could only be made by hand, such as 500 varieties of hammers and 45 kinds of axes in mid-19th century Britain. The upper class people in Britain, like the aristocrats and bourgeoisie, preferred handmade goods because they symbolized refinement and class. Handmade products were better finished and individually designed. Machine-made goods were mostly exported to the colonies. In the 19th century America, where there was a shortage of labor, industrialists relied on machines to reduce the need for human workers. In contrast, Britain had an abundance of available labor, so industrialists could easily hire workers and had less need to invest in labor-saving machines. Life of the workers. The oversupply of labor in the market had a significant impact on workers' lives. When news of potential job opportunities spread to rural areas, hundreds of people from the countryside flocked to cities in search of employment. Getting a job often depended on having connections. If you knew someone working in a factory, you were more likely to get hired quickly. Without connections, many job seekers had to wait weeks for a job. Some job seekers spent nights under bridges, in night shelters, or in places like night refuges set up by individuals or casual wards maintained by the poor law authorities. Work in many industries was seasonal, so workers faced long periods without work once the busy season ended. After winter, some returned to their countryside for work, but most stayed in cities looking for odd jobs, which were hard to find before the mid-19th century. Wages increased slightly in the early 19th century, but these averages hid big differences between jobs and year-to-year fluctuations. During the Napoleonic Wars, prices rose sharply and wages bought fewer things, reducing the real value of workers' income. Workers' overall income was determined not only by the wage rates that received, but also by the number of days they were able to find work. In the best times before the mid-19th century, about 10% of the urban population were extremely poor. During economic downturns, like in the 1830s, unemployment could increase sharply with 35 to 75% of people losing their jobs in different areas. The fear of losing job made workers resist new machines. For example, when the spinning jenny was introduced in the wool industry, women who relied on hand spinning attacked the machines. After the 1840s, cities saw more construction work, creating more jobs. Roads were widened, new railway stations were built, rail lines extended, and sewers and drainage systems were constructed. The number of workers in the transport industry doubled in the 1840s and doubled again over the next 30 years. Industrialization in the colonies. Now let's look at how industrialization took place in India, focusing on both factory industries and the non-mechanized sector. Our discussion will mainly focus on the textile industry. The age of Indian textiles. Before machine industries, India was known for its silk and cotton goods, which dominated the international textile market. While many countries produced rough cotton, the finest varieties came from India, and these were traded across Asia by Armenian and Persian merchants. Goods from Punjab were taken by camel through the northwest frontier, passing through mountains and deserts to reach Afghanistan, Persia, and Central Asia. India's pre-colonial ports like Surat on the Gujarat coast, Mausulipatnam on the Coromandel coast, and Hooghly in Bengal had vibrant sea trade links with the Gulf, Red Sea, and Southeast Asia. Indian merchants and bankers played a key role in the export trade, financing production, transporting goods, and supplying exporters. They gave advances to weavers and carried the finished cloth from villages to ports. At the ports, big shippers and export merchants used brokers to negotiate prices and buy goods from the supply merchants. By the 1750s, this trade network began to break down as European companies gained power. They secured concessions from local rulers and gained monopoly rights to trade. This caused a decline in old Indian ports like Surat and Hooghly, where local merchants had operated. Trade from these ports fell significantly, causing a major decline in business activity. The credit that supported trade vanished, leading to the bankruptcy of local bankers. For example, in the late 1600s, trade through Surat was worth rupees 16 million, but by the 1740s, it had dropped to rupees 3 million. While Surat and Hooghly declined, new ports like Bombay and Calcutta grew under European control, marking the rise of colonial power. Trade through these new ports was managed by European companies and carried in European ships. Many old trading houses collapsed, and those that wanted to survive had to adapt to the new European control trade system. These changes affected the lives of weavers and artisans as the demand for their goods decreased and they became dependent on European merchants for their livelihood. What happened to weavers? After the 1760s, the East India Company gained political power in Bengal and Carnatic, but this did not immediately reduce India's textile exports. British cotton industries had not grown yet, and Indian fine textiles were in high demand in Europe. Before gaining political control, the East India Company struggled to get a regular supply of goods because of competition from the French, Dutch, Portuguese, and local traders. weavers and merchants could sell to the highest bidder. After gaining political power, the company established a monopoly over trade. It created a system to eliminate competition, reduce costs, and ensure a steady supply of cotton and silk goods. First, the company removed existing traders and brokers, taking direct control over weavers. It hired a paid official called the Gomasta to supervise weavers, collect goods, and check the quality of cloth. Second, the company stopped weavers from selling to other buyers by giving them advances or loans to buy raw materials. Weavers who accepted the loan had to give all their cloth to the Gomasta and could not sell it to anyone else. As the demand for fine textiles grew, weavers eagerly took the advances, hoping to earn more. Many stopped farming and focused entirely on weaving, with their whole family, including women and children, helping in the process. However, conflict soon arose between weavers and Gomastas. Earlier, local merchants had close ties with the weavers and helped them in time of need. But the new Gomastas were outsiders, often acting arrogantly and arriving with soldiers to punish weavers for delays. Some weavers were even beaten. Weavers lost the ability to negotiate prices or sell to other buyers. The prices paid by the company were very low, and the loans they took forced them to stay tied to the company. In many areas of Carnatic and Bengal, weavers left their villages and set up looms in other places where they had family connections. Some weavers, along with local traders, revolted against the company. Over time, many weavers refused loans, shut down their workshops, and returned to agricultural labor. By the early 19th century, cotton weavers faced a new set of problems, making their situation even harder. Manchester comes to India. In 1772, Henry Patullo, a company official, believed that the demand for Indian textiles would never decline due to their superior quality. However, by the early 19th century, India's textile exports began to decline significantly. In 1811 to 12, textiles made up 33% of India's exports, but by 1850 to 51, this fell to only 3%. This decline happened because England's cotton industries grew and British industrialists wanted to protect their products from foreign competition. British industrialists pressured the government to impose import duties on Indian cotton textiles, making it easier for Manchester goods to sell in Britain. They also pushed the East India Company to sell British manufactured goods in India, leading to a surge in British cotton imports into India. By 1850, over 31% of India's imports were British cotton goods, and by the 1870s, this number had risen to over 50%. Indian weavers faced two problems. One, their export market collapsed, and two, the local market was flooded with cheap British imports which they couldn't compete with. Machine-made British cotton goods were produced at a lower cost, making it hard for Indian weavers to survive. By the 1850s, many weaving regions in India reported stories of decline and hardship. In the 1860s, the American Civil War cut off cotton supplies from the US, leading Britain to buy more raw cotton from India. This caused the price of raw cotton in India to rise sharply, making it difficult for Indian weavers to afford it. Weaving became unprofitable, and by the end of the 19th century, Indian factories began producing machine-made goods, further challenging the survival of traditional weaving industries. Factories come up. The first cotton mill in Bombay was set up in 1854 and started production in 1856. By 1862, there were 4 mills operating with 94,000 spindles and 2,150 looms. Jute mills were also established in Bengal around the same time. The first one was set up in 1855 and the another followed in 1862. In North India, the Elgin mill was started in Kanpur in the 1860s and a cotton mill was opened in Ahmedabad a year later. By 1874, Madras had its first spinning and weaving mill. The industries were set up by different entrepreneurs. Capital came from a mix of Indian and European investors. Workers in the mills were often local people from surrounding villages or migrants from rural areas looking for jobs. The early entrepreneurs. Different people set up industries in various regions of India, many of whom started in trade, especially with China. In the late 18th century, the British exported opium to China and brought tea to England. Many Indian traders became involved in this trade by providing finance, supplies, and shipping. Some traders, like Dwaraknath Tagore in Bengal, made their fortunes in the China trade and later invested in industries. Tagore set up 6 joint stock companies in the 1830s and 1840s, but they failed during the business crisis of the 1840s. In Bombay, Parsis like Dinsha Petit and Jamsetji Tata earned money through exports to China and raw cotton shipments to England, later becoming successful industrialists. Seth Hukumchand, a Marwari businessman, set up the first Indian jute mill in Calcutta in 1917. The Birla family also had trade connections with China. Other traders, especially from Madras, traded with Burma, the Middle East, and East Africa. Some merchants operated within India, moving goods, banking money, and financing traders. A British colonial control increased, Indian merchants were restricted. They could no longer trade manufactured goods with Europe and were limited to exporting raw materials like cotton, opium, wheat, and indigo. European managing agencies such as Bird Higglers & Co., Andrew Yule, and Jardine Skinner & Co. controlled many Indian industries until the First World War. These European agencies raised capital, set up joint stock companies, and made business decisions, while Indian financiers provided the money but had little control. European merchant industrialists had their own chamber of commerce where Indian businessmen were not allowed to join. Where did the workers come from? Factories needed workers, and as factories expanded, the demand for workers increased. In 1901, there were 5,84,000 factory workers in India, and by 1946, this number grew to over 24,36,000. Most workers came from nearby districts. Peasants and artisans who couldn't find work in their villages moved to industrial centers for jobs. In 1911, over 50% of workers in the Bombay cotton industries came from the nearby districts of Ratnagiri, while Kanpur mills hired workers mostly from the villages within the Kanpur district. Many mill workers moved between the city and their villages, going back home during harvests and festivals. Over time, as news about job opportunities spread, workers began traveling long distances to find work in mills. For example, people from the United Provinces went to Bombay's textile mills and Calcutta's jute mills. Getting jobs was difficult as more people sought work than the available jobs. Entry into mills was often restricted. Industrialists hired a jobber to recruit new workers. The jobber, usually an old and trusted worker, brought people from his village, helped them settle in the city, and assisted them during difficult times. The jobber became powerful, demanding money and gifts in exchange for favors and controlling workers' lives. The number of factory workers increased, but they still made up a small portion of the total industrial workforce. The peculiarities of industrial growth. European managing agencies dominated industrial production in India and focused on products like tea, coffee, mining, indigo, and jute, which were mainly for export, not for sale in India. Indian businessmen started setting up industries in the late 19th century, but avoided competing with British Manchester goods in the Indian market. Since yarn was not a major British import to India, early Indian cotton mills produced coarse yarn, that is thread, rather than fabric. Indian yarn was used by handloom weavers or exported to China. By the early 20th century, industrialization in India started changing. The Swadeshi movement encouraged people to boycott foreign goods, and industrialists pressured the government for tariff protection and concessions. From 1906, Indian yarn exports to China declined due to competition from Chinese and Japanese mills. So Indian industrialists shifted focus from yarn to cloth production. Cotton cloth production in India doubled between 1900 and 1912. Until World War I, industrial growth in India was slow. But the war created new opportunities for Indian factories as British mills focused on war production, reducing Manchester imports to India. Indian mills now had a large home market to supply and were called on to produce items for the war effort like jute bags, army uniforms, tents, and leather goods. New factories were built, old ones ran multiple shifts, and more workers were employed. Industrial production boomed during the war years. After the war, Manchester could not regain its old position in the Indian market. Britain's economy weakened and its cotton exports fell sharply. Indian industrialists grew stronger and replaced foreign goods with their own products. They successfully captured the domestic market, reducing reliance on imported goods. Small-scale industries predominate. After World War I, factory industries grew steadily, but large industries made up only a small part of the economy. In 1911, 67% of large industries were located in Bengal and Bombay, while small-scale production dominated in other parts of India. Only a small portion of the industrial workforce worked in registered factories, 5% in 1911 and 10% in 1931. Most workers were employed in small workshops and household units. In the 20th century, handicraft production, including handloom weaving, grew and expanded. This growth happened despite the challenges faced by the industry. Handloom cloth production grew significantly, nearly tripling between 1900 and 1940. This growth was partly due to the adoption of new technologies. Weavers began using looms with a fly shuttle, which increased productivity, sped up production, and reduced the need for labor. By 1941, over 35% of handlooms in India were fitted with fly shuttles, and in regions like Travancore, Madras, Mysore, and Bengal, the proportion was 70 to 80%. Weavers also made small innovations that helped them to compete with the mill sector. Some weavers made coarse cloth for the poor, which faced fluctuating demand, while others made finer cloth for the rich, whose demand remained stable even during bad times like famines. Mills couldn't easily replicate specialized weaves like Banarasi saris, lungis, and handkerchiefs, which continued to be made by weavers. Weavers and craft people did not always succeed, often working for long hours. In many cases, the entire family had to participate in the production process to make ends meet. Despite hard lives, their work was an important part of industrialization and not just a remnant of the past. Market for goods. British manufacturers wanted to take over the Indian market, while Indian weavers, craftsmen, traders, and industrialists resisted colonial controls and tried to grow their own markets. To sell new products, people needed to be convinced to buy them. Advertisements played a crucial role in creating new consumers by making the products appear desirable and necessary. Advertisements have been used since the start of the industrial age to expand markets and shape consumer culture. When Manchester industrialists started selling cloth in India, they used labels on cloth bundles to make their company and product familiar to buyers. The labels had "Made in Manchester" to assure buyers of the quality. They also featured images like Indian gods and goddesses to appeal to Indian customers and make foreign products feel more familiar. By the late 19th century, manufacturers began printing calendars to advertise their products. These calendars were hung in homes, shops, and offices, and people saw the advertisements daily even if they couldn't read. The calendars also featured images of gods, emperors, and nawabs, suggesting that products used by respected figures or made under royal command must be of high quality. Indian manufacturers used advertisements to promote Swadeshi, encouraging people to buy Indian-made products as a way to support the nation. Advertisements became a way to spread nationalist messages. Conclusion: the age of industries brought significant technological advancements, the growth of factories, and the creation of a new industrial workforce. However, as we have seen, traditional hand-based techniques and small-scale production continue to play an important role in the industrial landscape.